Okay. And just to move forward, I'm just doing that. I can get you a clicker. Everybody is fine. Okay. Well, let me just try. Nope, it doesn't work. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Okay. Well, hi everybody. So I'm gonna try to do a few things in our time today. First, I want to give you a little bit of background on how I got into this role, how I got into this work, but also give you a little bit of sense of who is the Nature Conservancy. Many people don't know who the Nature Conservancy is, but I'll give you a little bit of background on who they are. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Colorado River and kind of what some of the work, like what is the problem in the Colorado River. I have kind of a boiled down approach to it. And I'll try to give you that as well as the strategies that we're using in the Colorado River Basin because we're working in the whole basin. And then I'll give you some random career thoughts at the end. So hopefully will be helpful. Um, okay, so okay, there we go. So, okay, so kind of a quick background. So I'm a water attorney by training. I've been doing this work for 27 years or so. But how I got into it is kind of unusual. We all have our stories, right? We all have our stories from home and the things that influence us and kind of get us on a particular track or not. And most people, when you talk to them, like, oh, how'd you get into water? A lot of people will start off with, oh, I really loved playing in creeks as a kid or whatever. Like we all had that story, but then my story is a little different in that I grew up in Georgia. I'm from Atlanta. My parents, my family, my dad's side of the family is from a little town in Georgia called Elberton, which is just north of Athens, Georgia, if you know where that is, on the South Carolina border. So my dad, my grandfather, and my great grandfather were all very political, very in state government. They were all elected officials at various points in time. My dad was a litigator, but interestingly, my grandfather was like he served in all sorts of roles. But the thing that made him the most proud in all of his career, and he had some very esteemed aspects of his career, like he was a state Supreme Court justice. The thing that made him the most proud was he built a reservoir on the Savannah River. So as I was growing up, the only thing anybody ever talked about for like 6 years was this dam and getting this dam built on the Savannah River. And so we had this I grew up hearing like, well, how are we going to influence this? And how are we going to make this happen? And for those, you probably won't know this, but Jimmy Carter was president at the time. And Jimmy Carter he was very environmentally oriented and he wanted to deny permits for all dams being built, particularly in the West. This was Georgia, right? And so anyway, my dad and grandfather spent a lot of time going back and forth to DC, trying to figure out how can we get this dam built? And so eventually they got approval. It's a middle dam. There's 3 dams on the Savannah. There's the middle dam called Richard B. Russell Dam. And so I grew up hearing the politics of water and how do you get things done? How do you influence people? How do you form alliances? How do you kind of figure out all those pieces? And then I spent the next 6 years, I went to University of North Carolina and I was coming back and forth between there and home. And I'd pull off and go see my grandparents and we would go watch the dam being built. Literally, we would go down, put on the hard hats, tromp around, talk to the engineers. So it was a little bit of a different thing that didn't really even occur to me until I was much later of how connected I was with this kind of idea of how do we provide water for our communities, for recreation, for all the things that we need water for. It wasn't until maybe 4 or 5 years later, I was talking to one of my parents' friends who was very environmentally focused and involved in all these things. And he said, do you know what was lost when that dam was built? And I didn't. I hadn't really thought about it. And so I kind of getting that first glance or glimmer of what are the trade-offs in water? We all need water for drinking. We all need water for industry and for recreation and for all the different for farming in particular. So it wasn't until later that I kind of made that connection of you got to find the balance. So that has really driven me in my career is finding that balance between we need water for people. We also need water for the environment and for nature and for all the other uses that we need water for in the world. So Fast forward, I ended up going to law school in Vermont, wanted to be, Colorado was the last state I came to. I was like trying all these different ways to get here. And I finally got here as an intern in law school. And I worked up in the mountains. I really wanted to be in the mountains. I'm still up in the mountains, so that I was able to make that work for myself. But I came out and worked for an organization called Northwest Colorado Council of Governments Water Quality Quantity Committee. So doing water rights and water quality issues in the mountains. And it was all the mountain communities. So if you've been skiing and up in Summit County or Aspen or Winter Park, all those counties, those counties kind of banded together to have a stronger voice in state politics around water transfers. So as you probably or may know, 50% of the water that comes to that is 50% of the Front Range's water supply comes from the Colorado River. So that's really where I got my start, was trying to figure out how do we find that balance between the Front Range and the West Slope. So working for all those counties. Then I went from there to a group called the Colorado River District, which represents 15 counties on the Western Slope and has more of a stake in Colorado River issues and works with all the other state interests, but also the downstream interests. So that's where I started to get into issues, legal issues in particular, around the Colorado River Compact. And then my current role, I am the program director for the Nature Conservancy. So the program now works from the headwaters all the way to Mexico. And that's where I worked with Karen. And so my team, I'll talk about my team in a little bit, but we kind of cover everything. We've got engineers, we've got lawyers, we've got modelers, we've got biologists, we've got communications people. It's kind of everything. Because this work is so dynamic. It's got a little bit of everything. You've got to know a little history. You've got to know weather. You've got to know hydrology. You've got to know engineering. It's got it all. So if you're like me, I have a little bit of a monkey mind, and I'm like kind of always like, oh, squirrel. This is a great career because there's so many different facets of it that you never get bored. Switching gears to the Nature Conservancy and who that organization is. So the Nature Conservancy is an international nonprofit focused on environmental issues. We're the biggest environmental organization in the world. We work in 80 countries, 60 countries on the ground. We're heavily weighted towards scientists. So we have about 6,500 employees, and I think close to 1,000 are scientists. So we really try to have that kind of science focus. But I would also say we're really focused on solutions and partnership. We do everything through partnership. Water is a very partnership intense work. Everybody needs water. And it's very bipartisan too. You can kind of avoid the politics of today, and because everybody does need to work together to find these solutions, which I find very satisfying. Again, it recognizes my need to find those kind of that balance and trade-offs. And then let's see. And the other thing about the Nature Conservancy is very people and nature focused. So we don't sue people, or, you might have heard of groups like NRDC or EDF. They're more litigation focused, which is often needed. That's not how we show up. We're focused on work on the ground and partnerships. Okay, so now I'm going to switch a little bit to the Colorado River. These are old headlines. If you Googled Colorado River today, you get pages and pages and pages of stories. There's so much going on in this river basin right now. And it really, to me, it can be either a model of how to do things well and find that balance, or it can be an example of what not to do. And the story is not finished yet. So we are right in the middle of the story right now, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, just to orient everybody a little bit, that black line is the watershed. The hatched areas, the red hatched areas, are areas outside of the Colorado River Basin that get Colorado River water, including here in Fort Collins. As I mentioned, 50% of the Front Range's water supply, including a lot of ag water, comes from the Colorado River system. So sometimes people don't even recognize that they're getting Colorado River water. In places like New Mexico, Santa Fe and Albuquerque get Colorado River water, Cheyenne, Salt Lake, the Wasatch Front, and then of course the big one down in Southern California. About 19 million people in the Southern California area getting Colorado River water. In addition, they're also getting most of the ag water, and I'll talk about that in a second. So it's 40 million people, probably plus these days, are getting Colorado River water. It's a $1.2 trillion economy. If it were its own economy, it'd be the 12th biggest in the world. So it's very big. Do you remember Peter Culp came up with that? I don't know. So a guy we used to work with like did all the calculations to figure that out. I was like, oh, I would have never come up with that. 15% of US crops, if you're eating carrots or lettuce in the winter, it is coming from an area irrigated with Colorado River water anywhere in the United States. $26 billion recreation economy, that number's probably quite low. That was done more than 10 years ago. If you were anywhere in the state of Colorado during COVID, you experienced some of this recreational driven economy, whether it's river rafting or fishing or camping or skiing, all of that depends on water. Of course, 7 states in the US, 2 more states in Mexico, 30 tribal nations are also have reservations in this boundary and have claims to this water, which I'll touch on in a minute as well. 5 million acres of agriculture and very diverse agriculture. It's everything from the ranch lands that you see, or even around here, the agricultural lands here in this area, ranch lands on the upper Colorado and Wyoming. Then you get into like areas around Grand Junction where you've got peaches and specialty crops, peaches and grapes and cherries and sweet corn. And so kind of those real high value crops kind of in the middle of the basin. Then you get down to the lower part of the basin, Yuma area, Coachella, Imperial Valley. That area they get 9 to 11 crops per year. They are growing nonstop, which is they get the biggest chunk of Colorado River water. So just kind of hold that in your mind of like the different kinds of agriculture. Some of it's alfalfa, some of it's like real specialty crops like dates that are, real high value. So they get a lot of, we get a lot of use. It is a very hardworking river. And then of course, 11 national parks. So again, driving towards that recreational based economy. But some of the like crown jewels of the Park Service, like the Grand Canyon and Rocky Mountain National Park and Zion, really, really amazing places. Okay, so what is the challenge in this river system? Well, for one, it's important to remember that the climate change is water change, and the story of climate change will be written in water. We're seeing it play out all over the world right now. Literally just in the last month, flooding in Spain, Hurricane Milton. Who would have ever guessed? I am sure, having grown up in the North Carolina area, I am sure that people in Asheville, North Carolina had no idea what was about to hit them. They could not have imagined that a hurricane would have that impact. But we're seeing these really extreme storms. It's a zero-sum game. If you remember the water cycle lesson from when you were a kid, it's a zero-sum game, and we are messing with the water cycle. And that warmth is the temperature is what's really driving the change. And so we're seeing either too much or too little. Wrong time, wrong place. In the Colorado River Basin, we've lost 20% of our flows since 2000. So that is, and a lot of it is from greater evaporation levels, drier soils, and I'll again touch on this in a minute as well. And I would just say the longer we wait, the harder it is to solve these problems because it just gets more intense. And we've always had droughts in the West, I should say. But this is now, 24 years of drought. And that's like a new normal. Okay, so again, I mentioned that I would try to give you a very boiled down version so that when you read the paper and you're thinking about these issues, what are the challenges that we're dealing with and what are some of the strategies? So first, water scarcity, as I mentioned, and overuse. We are overusing this river system. We're using more every year than the river provides. Climate change is exacerbating that because of the heat, and the soils are drier, there's more evaporation. If you're here in the spring, you may remember how windy it gets. We're seeing these higher and higher winds that are just evaporating that snow off our mountaintops, and that snow is our water supply. Our legal governance, our legal frameworks and policies and laws have not kept pace with the changes we're seeing. So you may have heard mention of the Colorado River Compact or the 1944 treaty with Mexico. Those are just 2 really foundational policies and laws, but there's tons. Every state law has its own system. We all have different state water laws within the West. There's Endangered Species Act, there's Clean Water Act, there's all these different things that interact together, and they haven't really kept pace with what we're seeing in terms of climate change. And like they're not adapting. And so, for example, the Colorado River Compact divvied up the water among the 7 states. We didn't have Mexico in the mix until later, but they divvied up the water, and all these states feel a sense of entitlement. Like we're entitled to what you promised us in 1922. Well, 1922 was the wettest cycle in history, wettest 10 years in history. So we're now dealing with a much smaller river, much more people, and this legal entitlement, which is really probably one of the biggest challenges we face in the system. The other one that I don't have on here, but I usually do, so I'm not sure why I don't, but is the role of tribes. We have 30 tribes in the basin. They have rights to this water. If you added up all of their rights, it's more than 25%. They're not, but they haven't been given those rights in all cases. And so there's situations where they don't even have a full agreement yet with their state or federal government. So there's some uncertainty. So that uncertainty around tribes is a complicating factor that I think is going to also come out to is at play right now and will be for the next few years. So quick note on strategy. So this is what my team works on. We are focused on balancing water needs through innovation and water conservation efforts. And I'll talk about some of the examples of these things, but we're focused on improving green and gray infrastructure. So we get involved with dam operations. It's, again, coming back to my story of how I got into this. It's interesting to be able to work on dam operations and try to figure out the ways that we can mimic the natural system. So rivers have a natural cycle. They want to ensure that, they get the right spawning cues in the spring or in the fall, depending on the fish species. So we try to replicate that. And so we work with a lot of endangered species recovery programs to try to mimic that in our dam operations, which I assure you did not happen 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And then supporting voice, choice, and action of Indigenous people. The tribes have been left out of the conversation for a long time. And even my program, which I've been doing this particular role for about 16 plus years, working with tribes has been an evolution even for my team. We have a person on our team dedicated to working with tribes who has those relationships and kind of works organically with the tribes to bring them into the conversation. But first we have to get them to the table, and they're sovereigns and we're not. So it's a little bit of an interesting dynamic where we're actually trying to put them up on a higher pedestal so they can advocate for their interests, which, it can be complicated, and it has to be slow work because you have to let tribes lead. They are, they have been left out of these conversations and negotiations for far too long. Okay, so our interest in this, I'm pretty simply boiled down, is getting water in the right place at the right time, river health and wildlife, long-term resilience and sustainability. None of the work that my team does or any of our NGO partners will work if we don't have a system that is sustainable. If we are going to keep overusing the system, we're going to be in crisis all the time. And then who's going to care about fish or recreation when you're just dealing with these shortages all the time? So we're trying to make sure that the system is resilient and sustainable. And then finally, supporting voice, choice, and action, as well as vision that these Indigenous communities have. In terms of how we work, and I'll highlight this just because you might be thinking about, if you're thinking about careers in this work, partnerships are everything in this work. As I said, that's how Karen and I met, but there's so many different partnerships. We partner with ag, we partner with cities, we partner with federal government, we partner with states, we partner with industry, and it has to be a bit opportunistic too. Like you have to figure out who's willing to kind of trust us and work with us. I mean, when I first started this program, somebody asked me a question at a conference: what keeps you up at night and what gives you hope? And the answer was agriculture for both, because they use about 70 to 80% of the water supply, but we all need food and fiber, right? So that's that balance thing of how do we consider those trade-offs? And so we work a lot with agriculture, and we have come a long way. but it's slow going. And same with tribes. We have to be listening to what they want and then try to meet them where they're at. So partnerships are how we get things done. Water, as I mentioned, is pretty bipartisan. You can find key alliances, like we can show up at Congress with farmers or with groups from very conservative parts of a state. And I work in all 7 states, so we do work. We show up at these meetings and in places like Congress with partners, unusual bedfellows. But it is also very political. There's trade-offs and kind of horse trading that goes on. We also focus on solutions. There's these huge negotiations that I mentioned going on right now around the rules that operate the Colorado River, and those will be going on through the next year and a half. But I don't have influence over those. Those are one state representative from each state is in the room. But what we can do is help communities, and what we can do is help farmers use less water. And so we can help tribes find solutions for their long-term resilience. That then can translate, I think, into coalitions that can change policy. So I can't go influence the negotiations tomorrow, but I can create more kind of focusing on the art of the possible. What can we do together? And I found that to be really powerful. The other thing I just mentioned is this is like 6-dimensional chess. It's got like if you do something in California, it has a ripple effect in Colorado. If you do something in Mexico, it's going to impact Arizona. It's all connected. It's connected through history. It's connected through legislation and politics. It's connected through, our Nevada program had been pretty quiet for a while. And they called us this was 10 years ago, and said, I think Nevada is going to totally overhaul their water rights administration laws. Every state in the West was like, what? They wanted to understand what was going to change, because if Nevada changed something, Arizona might want to change the same thing, or it just might show people what's possible. So you have to kind of be watching all the pieces, which is good for people with monkey minds. Okay, so I want to just give you a few examples of the kind of work we do to give you a little more specificity. So I mentioned that we have to find ways of balancing water use among these different sectors. So one of the projects, we do a lot of what we call innovative water sharing. It's working with farmers or tribes or maybe cities to find ways to help them reduce their water use or put more water back in the system. Lots of different ways that can happen, but one way that we're involved in a project with the Jicarilla Apache Nation. This is the San Juan River, and the Jicarilla Apache Nation had water rights that they had been using. They have water rights under a settlement with the federal government and the state of New Mexico, but they couldn't use all their water on the reservation. It was in Navajo Reservoir, which was not connected to their reservation physically. So they were leasing that water to coal plants in the Four Corners area. Coal plants are starting to shut down, as you might know. So suddenly they were had all this water, but no way to make money off of it and nowhere to lease it. They could have leased it to farmers. They could have leased it to other industry in the San Juan Basin. Others were interested in buying the water and maybe leasing it to make a profit, or a lot of different groups that were interested in their water. We approached them and proposed an idea of what if we could leave this water in the river, but we pay you for it so that it can help create water security. That water ends up at Lake Powell, which is kind of the upper basin's bank account. It would kind of help water security for the region. This is a stretch that has 2 endangered fish in it, and we're working with the tribe on helping to recover those fish. So it helps the fish. It helps recreation as well, which is an economic driver. And it was testing a tool. If the state of New Mexico would get involved, we could test a policy tool that they had on the books but had never used in the Colorado River Basin, which allowed them to lease water or buy water for compact security or endangered species. Well, this water could do both, but they had never used it in this basin. So we pitched it to Jicarilla Apache Nation. They agreed. We went and talked to the state of New Mexico, and all during COVID, which made it all the harder because we couldn't meet in person, we came up with an agreement that allowed this kind of win-win-win-win-win. And now that is not only allowing to keep more water in the river, it's helping with water security at Lake Powell. It's 20,000 acre feet a year. So if you're familiar with an acre feet, it's a lot of water. It's the biggest lease that I know of in the West. So it's a 10-year agreement. It's tribal water, so it can't be ever purchased outright. It has to be a lease. But it gives them, it also, what we're allowed to do in that agreement is help the tribe have a sovereign to sovereign negotiation with the state of New Mexico, which they had never done before. So just those are the kinds of projects we're looking for. And the work that we did with Karen in Mexico with the binational agreement is a similar kind of thing. I love it when it's like the win, 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 win. And that's what we're always looking for. Okay, so I mentioned agriculture. So we work a lot with agriculture because they do use, so this is the Grand Valley, they do use so much water. And again, to grow food and fiber for all of us. So I'm not pointing fingers, but they are the largest user. So if we're going to find ways to reduce our overall use, we've got to find ways to partner with agriculture. As I mentioned, sometimes that starts with just lining a ditch. Maybe that's putting in a head gate just to start to build the relationship. Then we start talking to them about what might be possible. How can maybe we work in Grand County, which is where Winter Park is. We're doing some work up in that region, growing new types of forage grass for cows that are less water intensive. So not growing hay, which is one of the bigger water users, or alfalfa, but trying kernza, which does not need as much water and has actually more protein and more nutrition for cattle, but it's never been grown here. So we're trying some things like that. The reason we focus on ag and not cities either is because cities have tons of resources. They have money, they have staff, they have political will. If they want to do a conservation program, they do a conservation program. They don't need a lot. Farmers, if you look at this picture, those are tons of little family farms. They are not set up to have resources available to them. They're not going to take risk to try something new unless we minimize that risk. So we partner a lot with ag to find ways to help them try new things, but also minimize that risk. So they're not like worried about losing their water rights or some other, if they don't want to get dinged for not using all their water. And so we'll work with them to change the law even if that's what's needed. But my favorite story is out of Arizona. We work in the Verde River, which is upstream of Phoenix. And they grow a lot of alfalfa there. In the summer, the river was going dry. So we started our program there kind of first, like lining some head gates and putting in some like modern structures where they could change the head gate from using their phone rather than having to go out in a thunderstorm and close the head gate, which nobody ever did. So, but as we got to know these farmers, we started kind of getting to figure out what did they need to make a living? What did they need to be operational? And so the example we came up with though was we were like, what if we grew barley rather than alfalfa? Barley's a winter crop, so it doesn't need summer irrigation. So this farm would no longer be pulling water out in the summer when it was hot, and it's a winter crop, so it relies a lot on rain, doesn't need a lot of irrigation from the creek. But then as soon as we started kind of getting into this with the farmer, they're like, well, who will we sell it to? So we had to then go and figure out the market, like who's going to buy this? So we actually, the Nature Conservancy invested in a malt house that now takes this barley from the farmers. And now we've got a tribe in the area also growing barley and sending this to the malt plant, which sells the malt and the barley to breweries and bakeries in the valley. So when it comes to farming, you can't just say, oh, just try a new crop. You have to think it all the way through. And so it is a very complex body of work, but also really interesting if we're going to solve these problems at a global scale. Okay, so the last kind of example I wanted to give is about restoration and resilience. And who was here in the area in Colorado in like 2020 to 2021? Got a couple. Okay. So it was during COVID. We had terrible wildfires here in the fall of 2020. Here in Fort Collins, the Cameron Peak fire, East Troublesome fire. It's the worst fire year for Colorado in history. So it was very dry in the fall. We had a decent snowpack, like 95% snowpack. We had a 33% runoff. that was a game changer. For me personally, I had always thought, oh, we just have to fix the math problem. We just have to get farmers to use less water and we'll be fine. I started to realize the watershed, that the system was broken. And we were losing so much water to these dry soils. And so the way when snow melts, it flows through, but it first has to like saturate the soil before it ever makes it to the creek or the river or the lake. And so we were losing that. And so it was like we started thinking about, well, what could we do about forest health or wetlands? That picture I showed earlier where there was wetlands are amazing. They do everything. They help regulate water when it's dry or when it's flooding. They'll slow water down. If it's dry, they'll actually like kind of slow it down and release it over a longer period of time. So you'll have better base flows. So we started thinking, okay, could we do more restoration in the watershed? So we've got a project up in Rocky Mountain National Park with Northern Conservancy District. You guys are hearing from Esther, or maybe you already have. So we're talking about, could we do some things over on the western side of the divide? But maybe we also need to look at our forest health, because our forest, if those of you who've been up in our forest, they're pretty decimated by beetles and there's so much dead forest. And so we have to start thinking about that too. This is, again, a bit newer body of work. It's so big. It's a little bit hard to get your mind around, but I think if we're going to make the system truly work and be sustainable, we've got to tackle this as well. Okay, so this is the career planning random pieces of advice and thoughts. So the fun thing about water is there's a place for everybody, no matter what your background, what your experience is, what kind of skills you have. There is like this is a team picture from years ago. My team is a little bigger now, but I would just get, so members of my team include, we have a bunch of lawyers, we have quite a few engineers, we have scientists, we have biologists, we have modelers, we have communications people, we have tribal specialists. We have a person who's focused only on agriculture, working with ag, developing those partnerships. So I think that's what I love about water is it is so interdisciplinary that you can kind of do anything. And this team, like that group is so diverse. I can't even tell you like how diverse that, like all those different skill sets in our team. So a couple things I just wanted to share was like, as you're thinking about career options, keep your options open. Like I'm a big believer in hedging your bets, so to speak, early in your career. I would say, I would recommend keeping, like, think about 2 or 3 things you like. When I first got into my work, I was doing water quality, land use, and water rights. Over time, first it made me more marketable because I had 3 different skill sets that I could work on. So it was easier to get a job with government, for example, because I could do multiple things. So once you're kind of in the track, you'll then figure out, oh, I really want to do water quality or water rights or whatever. So it kind of lets you, but it keeps your options open early so you can kind of get a sense of what you appreciate and what you like and where your strengths are. So kind of early on, try to be as expansive and broad in your mind thinking as possible. I also wanted to talk about the difference between working for private sector versus NGOs versus the state, because I talk to a lot of people looking for jobs, and I would say the best debt hedging move is to start early with government. I think there's government often underfunded with lots of work and not enough staff. So you end up, which doesn't sound great, right? But you get lots of exposure. You get lots of like people, they will throw you in the deep end and you will get so much experience so fast. If that's your thing and you're okay with that, you get a lot of opportunity really early. So I think government's a great place to start. Private sector, especially early in your career, it's going to be pretty narrow. You're going to be working on very narrow things. You're not going to often have the whole picture. You might make decent amount of money, which absolutely might be a criteria in your decision because you got to pay back the school loans and all those things. But you don't get to see it all come together. You're often working on that one little piece. And again, I think private sector, one thing I will say is I've seen people go into private sector. It's hard to then transfer out because you're like, ooh, I really like that money. So it's private sector can be a later in life thing. You'll have a more senior leadership role at that point when you go back. So just something to think about. And then NGOs, working for at least the environmental sector, but many NGOs, is like the money's not going to be great early, and it's really hard to get those jobs. So I would say wait on working for an NGO if that's your passion, if that's what you want to do. That might be a better position to go later. You become very attractive to an NGO when you have that government experience or private sector experience. And then you're coming in at a higher level. You're coming in with more leadership opportunities. NGOs coming in at entry level is pretty hard, but it is possible. And there are more and more of those options available. So I don't want to discourage that. I just kind of wanted to distinguish that each has pros and cons, and just think about what's your number one driver. Is it that you want to do work you care passionately about? Then maybe try with the NGO for a while, or even the state. If you need to make money right off the bat, maybe the private sector is a better way to go. So anyway, there are trade-offs there. One thing I would just throw out there is the number one thing I'm looking for when I'm hiring. And I've had some crazy hiring experiences. For one position, I had 380 candidates. That's a lot of people. So like how do you distinguish between 380 people, right? So, you kind of have to boil it down on skill first. So you kind of get down to maybe that top 10, top 15. Then when things are all equal, I'm looking for a team player. I am looking for people who are going to have a can-do attitude. They're going to support their teammates. They're going to make the whole work better. And I feel really fortunate because I've been able to do that. And of course, I've learned the hard way along the way as well. But that's like the kind of the number one, I think, thing. When you're part of a team, you need a team player. So again, if people are going into these kind of sectors, keep that in mind, is that kind of can-do attitude really does matter. And it's something when it gets down to like three people who are all amazing skill set wise, that thing can push you over the edge. And the last thing I'd just say is be specific about what you want. And again, keep in mind the broader lens, the broader aperture when you're starting to get into your work. Kind of don't get too focused too early. But if you're specific, I find that people start helping you out. They start, if you're talking about, I really want to do this kind of work, doors start to open. And this is just a silly example, but when I got out of law school and someone asked me what I wanted to do, I was like, I want to live in the mountains. I want to take my dog to work. I was a lawyer and I was like, I don't want to wear a suit. I want to work for the good guys. I had these like kind of silly criteria. Well, I got all that. I forgot to ask for money. So that was like one of those things of like, I had to figure out later. And then in my second job, I started my parents asked me, what do you want to do next? And I was like, well, I have all these skills that I've developed working in this job for these counties, but I don't really have great water rights experience. And so I really want to do more water rights work. But I feel like I need to leverage my water quality and land use work to have something of value to offer. I kid you not, a month later, I started really thinking about what I wanted. A month later, I got a call from my second group that I worked for, and they said, our associate counsel's leaving. We're not posting the position. We're interviewing 3 people. Would you like to be one of them? And I got the job. So, but it's like, and then I started doing all water rights stuff. So I got like totally what I wanted. So just, I don't know, sounds a little woo-woo, but I'm a big believer in putting it out there to the universe, and the universe usually helps you out. So just, it helps to be specific. If you're just like, I don't know, then it's hard to help. So I think I will stop there and see if there are questions or anything you want to add, Karen.
Let's take questions.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for this. Are there any like projects that you are currently working here in Colorado right now that you think might change later on with the new administration?
Yes. Yes, thank you. Thanks for the question. So the question was, are we working on anything here in Colorado that could change because of the new administration and just the changing political situation? 100%. So we work with, I think the biggest change we're going to see is around funding. There is because of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, huge flows of money were coming to this region, and a lot of it targeted to dealing with drought, dealing with climate change. I think this new administration will probably turn off the faucet. And I'm not saying endless money is the answer to everything, but it was really starting to make some headway and some progress, in particular with tribes. We were starting to work with tribes about getting drinking water on the Navajo Nation. So that's not Colorado, but I think that's gonna turn it. So I think the tribes will probably feel quite a lot of impact because they had a very sympathetic administration in this last administration. Secretary Interior was from New Mexico and was a tribal member herself. And that was very important to this administration. It's not so important I don't think it's going to be very important to this administration. So I think we'll see that. We'll see. So tribes, funding. The other one is working with the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management. Those are two agencies that they control and manage like 80% of our public lands in the state. And we're trying to get them to change how they manage to make the system more resilient. This administration will probably not support that kind of work so much. So we'll see that, I think, change. I think we'll see a reduction in staffing in those agencies. Well, I think we'll see a less of an interest in trying some of these new Forest Service management protocols or wetlands protocols with the BLM. So the list could go on and on, I'm afraid. So, I mean, time will tell, right? We don't know exactly where the energy is going to be. I've been seeing, typically Department of Interior is who we work with at the federal level. And we're waiting to see who the appointment will be. And it could be really different. If we get somebody from South Dakota, maybe not as focused on water as someone like Governor Gordon from Wyoming would be very focused on water. So it will make a difference who that person is. And then the other thing I would mention is the work with Mexico. It's not Colorado, but I think there's this relationships with Mexico is going to be more intense. And we have negotiations that are kicking off right now to set the next set of operational rules between the US and Mexico on the Colorado River. And so I think that's an area we're going to be watching closely to see, does that take a turn for the worse? Do we not, is the US is less willing to negotiate? I will say we were able to negotiate one of these agreements under the last Trump administration. So I'm hopeful that it won't, that the bipartisan nature of water will sort of, help us come to a good solution no matter what. But again, time will tell. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
What would you expect to see change if there was another really bad drought?
We've had so many. 2021, 2002 was the worst in the last 50 years. We all have so many, there's so many challenges on people's plates, right? In society today. It's easy to have it be out of mind when there's, if the drought isn't too bad, if people aren't being, having water conservation programs in their community, or farmers aren't talking about drought, out of people's mind. We got a lot of other things to worry about. When we do have extreme drought, it does turn up the volume on the political pressure. So I think if we see another year like that, I'm hopeful that we get past the partisanshipness that's going on right now, and that we will get back to finding a solution that works for the whole region. So right now, the negotiations that are going on right now are focused on how the states share shortages, because as I mentioned, we've lost 20% of our flow. Lakes Powell and Lake Mead are about 30% full. So that's what the negotiations are about, is who takes shortages when. And that's also the negotiation ongoing with Mexico. So if we see even greater shortages or greater drought, and the reservoirs drop even more, it gets really dire really fast. We're right at the edge. We are it's not really a joke, but it's like if you're standing at the edge of this cliff, if we have a good year, we kind of take a step back. And if we have a okay year, we're just standing still. We're like right at the edge. So if we have a couple bad years, it really can throw this region into chaos. And just maybe a finer legal point is we could then start getting into a situation where the upper basin is not delivering what it owes to the lower basin. That could trigger legal action, which throws it into the Supreme Court, which then, if it goes to the Supreme Court, it could take 15 years to be figured out. Meanwhile, what do our farmers do? What do our cities do? And I would point out that, and I'm not trying to scare anybody, but like our cities are junior to the compact. So they would be the first ones to be cut off if we followed strict prior appropriation and administration. We got to figure all those things out because we're not going to turn our cities off, I wouldn't think. So how do we figure out those rules ahead of time? And that's where we are right now. So bottom line, if we have another really serious year, we turn up the volume and the urgency just increases. But does that answer your question? Okay, thanks. We're watching it closely because every year is a new, excuse my French, it's a crapshoot, right? We don't know what the weather's going to do. So we have to kind of keep a close eye on that. Yeah, does Fort Lewis have any questions?
Yeah, we do.
Excellent.
Do you see a solution to providing infrastructure to Native American tribes to help them with water settlements on the lower Colorado, especially where we've been taking out of the Colorado River to put it into the Arkansas River watershed?
So are you talking about the lower Colorado in like Arizona and California, or are you talking about here in Colorado?
Mostly Arizona, and where a lot of the Navajo Nation is, south of below Lee's Ferry.
Yeah. So I'm extremely hopeful that we can provide the infrastructure and the finalized settlements for tribes. We have this conversation internally and with tribal partners. It may not be even what was promised amount wise, but maybe we can make it up in infrastructure. Maybe with Navajo Nation, we can get drinking water to their homes. I would take that as a win. But we've also got to, everybody's supply is shrinking. And so I think that's the bottom line we're struggling with is that you can't get blood from a turnip. So how do we shrink the whole supply, but give the communities, including tribal nations, what they need? We do need to make good on these settlements, and that creates a lot of uncertainty, not only for the tribal nations, but also for all the other water users. So we've got to find a way to address that, both the infrastructure and the legal questions that are outstanding. Does that answer your question? I mean, that's such there's a lot of complexity in that work, but.
Yeah, I think that's close. I worry more about the tribes right there by Monument Valley that suffer from the water that runs through the uranium tailings from the 40s. Their drinking water was heavily affected.
Yeah. And each tribal nation, like our tribal partners like to say, if you've met one tribe, you've met one tribe. Every tribe has different issues they're dealing with and different challenges. And again, all we can do is help those tribes find solutions that will work for their communities. And so that's the hope. And I do worry with this administration that it won't be as easy as maybe it was in the last administration to get the funding and support. Any other questions on that end?
None over here. Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
What do you see? I know there's, I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's like the conservation alternative for the negotiations. What are you hoping comes out of that proposal? And can you just explain what I'm talking about?
Yep, and I'll repeat the question. So Karen was asking about the conservation alternative that's been submitted by the NGO community to this bigger negotiation that's going on. So I mentioned these operating rules. They're called guidelines. Basically, they are an effort to adapt to the hotter, drier conditions. And so in 2002, we had one of the worst droughts on record. That was like a shocking year. And that was really the wake up call that maybe the Colorado River system wouldn't have as much water in the future as it had in the past. And so that was kind of the first clue. In 2003, the 7 basin states were negotiating, well, what do we do with surplus? When we have more water, what do we do with that? And by the end of those negotiations, they had to quickly turn to what do we do when there's not enough water? And so in 2007, we passed these rules called interim guidelines. They expire in 2026. That's what the negotiations are about right now, is trying to figure out who takes those shortages. So typically the states are the ones at the table. And the states, as I mentioned earlier, have one representative. The governor appoints someone from each state to negotiate. It's a mess right now. Like the upper basin and lower basin are not anywhere close to an agreement, which hurts us all, right? And from an environmental community perspective, we can't do anything if the states can't come to an agreement among themselves. So we need those states to come to some kind of an agreement about to provide certainty around who's going to take shortages when. So that's what the negotiations are about right now. The conservation community, so 7 NGOs, including the Nature Conservancy, but also Audubon, Environmental Defense Fund, Trout Unlimited, Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, and American Rivers and Western Resource Advocates, which is in Boulder, all put in a proposal together, basically trying to push the states, our goal was to both make both the upper basin and lower basin happy and mad at the same time. We figured if we could do that, we might actually be onto something. We were really trying to put more ideas out there. The upper basin states and the lower basin states each put in an alternative, but they've sunk into their positions and they're not budging. And so our goal was just to try to push the conversation, put some new ideas out there. We also really wanted to flag that not all things will be solved by the guidelines, because the guidelines really only apply to Lake Powell and Lake Mead. It's really just how the 2 basins share water. It doesn't get into, well, how are we going to pay for adaptation strategies in the future? How are we going to pay farmers? How are we going to pay for forest resilience work? All that stuff is what we call parallel processes. So we were also trying to really push the idea of let's put in some, we need to keep the reservoirs higher. We can't keep living in crisis. So that was one thing we were trying to do. We put in an idea called conservation reserve, which is like, can we incentivize conservation that water then gets stored in Lake Powell and Lake Mead to raise both reservoirs? So we don't expect it to be adopted wholesale, but we were trying to push the concepts of, we can do better. And we can come up with something that works for nature as well as for our communities and our industry and our farmers and our tribes. So we'll see. We're going to hear, I think, at the end of December, what the alternatives framework looks like. And then in January, we'll start getting into which alternatives might work. But that's why I have a modeler on my team. I don't know if any modelers are in the room, but I ended up hiring a modeler because I was like, we've got to have someone on our team who can engage with the federal agency on the model itself, because decisions get made with models. So anyway, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, sure. Anything else? Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
You. Okay. Go enjoy your Monday. It's Monday, right?
On Monday. Until today was Veterans Day. Oh, no, my son didn't have daycare, of course. How old is he?
He's 3.
Oh, gosh. So, yeah.
So what'd you do? Let me just stop recording.
Oh, yeah. So you don't tell somebody about.